Elohim,
the supreme God,
El Olam,
the everlasting God,
Elohim Emet,
the God of truth,
El Shaddai,
God Almighty,
El HaKovod,
the God of glory,
El HaKadosh,
the holy God,
El Tzaddik,
the righteous God,
Elohim Chaim,
the living God,
Yehovah Chatov,
the good Lord,
Emmanuel,
God with us.
Eyeh,
I am.
Today we are continuing on the series on the names of God. We are jumping from the Old Testament into the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we'll be looking at lots of the names of Jesus, and we'll be saving that name for last, that name that is above every name. So that'll be the end of our series. Now, in ancient Israel, most people only had one name, what we think of as a first name, but not also a last name, as in like Thompson. They didn't have that. It was just like the name Jesus. Now, when God came to our world, he was simply named Jesus. His last name isn't Christ. Some of you don't realize that, and some of you maybe misuse that, but that's not his last name. That is a name he has, but that's not his last name. And actually, his name in Hebrew was probably Yeshua. We got that there? Which means Joshua. Now, the New Testament translated it into the Greek, and I'm not even going to pronounce that. You see that in the third line there, from which we get the Latin name there, and from that we get the name Jesus. And so it's kind of changed from language to language a little bit, but that name Jesus or Joshua means the same thing. To distinguish people during that time, because they only had one name. I mean, if you say Mark, you'd have all these Marks looking, so it could be Jesus of Nazareth. So you might use a town to distinguish where they are from, or not just a town, but you might actually use their occupation. Jesus the carpenter was referred to. That way you get a little bit more specific as far as who it is. Beyond that, you also have, sometimes it was distinguished by brothers. You might say, hey, Jesus, the brother of James. Or even you could go beyond that and say, the son of. And that was probably one of the most common things, because again, everybody had a name, but you would be Jesus, the son of, and then you would put in the name. Or Peter or whoever was often referred to in that way. Now, beyond just the name that they had, and then the identifying town or occupation or family member, they also would have some titles, just like we have titles today. We have titles like president, senator, judge, doctor, professor, and they had those types of things back then as well. Well, although more than one title can be attributed to the same person, each title usually has something significant about that. And as we look at Jesus, he had several different titles, and each of those show a little bit different character or something that's unique about him in his role with us and how he relates to you and me. Now, we're going to be looking in John 1 today. John 1 has several names of Jesus right in that first chapter of John. I'm not going to list them all, but there's a whole bunch of names that are there. And I encourage you just to try and hunt through some of those this week and see how many names of Jesus can you find in John chapter 1. Before we read that verse, I want to share with you a story of two houses. One of the houses is straight off the cover of Architectural Digest. I know not everybody subscribes to that, right? But it's a cool magazine that shows all these neat features of houses. Well, its floors gleam with fresh wax. Its walls are bright with unspotted hues. Its drapes, its paint, its furnishings are all color coordinated, without one thing in the whole house clashing. Tasteful accents are here and there, kind of pretending to be random, but they're all in perfect order, placed not 1 centimeter to the left or to the right off of where they ought to be. In this house, the climate control system balances the temperature, the humidity, the particle count, and the ozone level. The windows are specially treated with an electron layer that repels the dust and haze both inside and out. I got to get me some of those windows. How many like to do windows? Just a few of you. I didn't think many of you. Raise your hands again. I know who to call over next time I'm doing windows. Thank you. But they're treated with this layer. The lighting is on sensor so that as the darkness comes in, the lights begin to come up slowly and gradually, keeping this soft glow in the room no matter what is happening on the outside. In fact, it matters little what's happening on the outside, for the room is controlled. It is sealed off. Now, across a carpet on which mysteriously no footprints ever appear, stands this group of people talking. Their clothing coordinates with the decor of the room. They're elegantly accessorized. Their teeth line up in perfect smiles. Their hair is done meticulously, all in place, very cautiously, cool, calm, and collectly. They're having a discussion, but it reminds you of the old question, how do porcupines hug each other? Anybody know? Very carefully. This is a house that it looks immaculate, it looks perfect, everything is in order. It's an incredible house. Now, the other house is straight off the cover of the Antiques Roadshow. Its floors, so far as we can see them, could use some attention. Where the dog toenails have scratched, definitely could use some attention. We have in our bedroom the spot where Buffy tried to get out of our bedroom and clawed up the carpet. So it's just a patch of carpet that's bare now. Obviously, if we sold that house, people would notice that, but we don't even notice that place in the carpet anymore. Its walls have some small, grimy handprints that are about this high off of the wall. Its furnishings are a mixed bag of early Orange Crate and later Kmart. Its drapes sag a little, its paint is cracked here and there, and where the magazines have been piling up, there's a coffee cup that's half empty, and a pizza box that's half full of pizza. As one of the light bulbs is burned out, the other's hidden by someone's sweater who pitched it over the lamp as they were going to try and get the phone. On the other side of the room, I see some people talking. Can you see them? Can you picture them? It seems very animated, not like the other house. It's loud. In fact, it's an argument. I know that doesn't happen in your homes, but it happens in this one. They are raising their voices and waving their hands. In fact, one of them has her hands on her hips and is giving the old foot-stomping effect. Men, you've seen that before, right? Ladies, you maybe have seen that as well. Now, the other is shaking his head as vigorously as his old neck will allow, back and forth, back and forth. It's sort of tense in this home. It's heated, it's stressful. When God chose to come into our world in the flesh, He was not looking to come to a place that was in perfect order. Everything just right. His desire was to come into the homes that would fit the cover of Antiques Roadshow. God says, I'm not looking for this perfection. I'm looking for love, for messy though it may be people. I'm looking for real, rough-edged men and women into whose hearts I can come. The Lord wants to be in our hearts and in our homes. He wants to be in the lives of those who maybe homes are poor, or you're lonely, or you're filled with stress, and you're filled with sin. He wants to be among those whose houses are not perfect, and neither are their lives. He wants to settle down with those whose floors sag, and so do their spirits. Those whose windows are grimy, and so are their souls. Today, we'll begin this transition, and we'll be looking at the name, the Word of God. Let's look at John chapter 1, verse 1 to 18. I'm going to turn, and I'm going to have you read this with me, if you would. In the beginning was the Word. Out loud, if you would. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me will have surpassed me because he was before me." From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. I think that's it. How many need a drink of water after that? Go ahead, take a sip. The opening words, John writes, "in the beginning," probably has this conscious reminder of the first words of the Bible where it says, "in the beginning." See, John is now writing about this new beginning, a new creation. There's continuity between the first creation and now. You see, the Word was in the beginning. He doesn't have a start, and that blows our mind, but he was in the beginning. He was there at creation. Before all else, there never was a time when the Word was not. The term word means logos and applies to Christ in these verses. The Word, it points to the truth that is the very nature of God to reveal himself. God wants to reveal himself to you and to me. And he chose to reveal himself through Jesus Christ. He said, "I'm going to send my Son to reveal who I am so that they can get to know me and have a relationship with me." Verse 14, I love verse 14. In the Message, it says, "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish." I love that. Moved into the neighborhood. Actually, it means made his dwelling, means he pitched his tent. He came and he pitched his tent. He moved into our neighborhood. Now think of the neighborhoods where you live. Some of you live in some really awesome neighborhoods, and some of you wish you could probably move. Some of you have neighbors that you just want to call the cops on. It's 2 a.m. and the party's going on, and it is loud. Bobby and Jen, do you remember that years and years ago? Going through some of that. Pastor Sam's dealt with some of that a little bit too. Not now, but I don't think, but in the past, getting a little bit loud for the kids to sleep. Some of you have had great neighborhoods. Some of you have lived in terrible ones. Darla's neighborhood was a little bit different than the one I grew up in. She had neighbors where they weren't mean, but I don't know why it was, but when Darla and the kids would play ball in their yard, if the ball ever left their yard and went into that neighbor's yard, they couldn't go get it. At least if the neighbors were home. So that ball would sit there, the game was done, it was over, or they'd find another ball, another game to play. Once in a while, they were gutsy, and they would actually sneak over into the yard and grab the ball and come back. But again, I don't know why that was. Now, Fast forward years later, we're married, we're living in the parsonage here in town, and we're outside, and all of a sudden, Darla sees this kid riding his bike, and he leaves the sidewalk in front of the house, and he actually rides through the grass of our yard. And Darla was like to me, "Hey, what's he doing?" I'm like, "He's riding his bike." "Yeah, but he just rode his bike through our yard." I'm like, "Yeah? What's the problem with that?" Well, for her, you didn't go into the neighbors' yards at all. I've shared with you the story of one neighbor in our block that was a little bit meaner than the others. My dad grew up on the same block in which I did. In fact, let's go to the picture of that house, if you would. That's the home where I grew up on. We used to have a couple trees to climb right there, and they were gone with Dutch elm disease. Love this neighborhood, but around the block, on the other side of this block, this lady was, and my dad grew up in the house right behind there, where my grandparents lived while I grew up here. But we would ride our bikes, and if we ever went off the sidewalk and touched a blade of her grass, she was outside and she was yelling at us. So being the nice kids that we were, every once in a while, we would purposely leave the sidewalk and go into her yard just to see what she might do. I shared this with my dad, and my dad was like, "You know what? I did that when I was a kid too." The very same thing to the very lady. But most of my experiences are wonderful. You can kind of go to the next house there. Next one, if you would. That's just another view. So this is the other side of it. And so the darker house in the middle was where my grandparents lived. I loved living next door to Grandma and Grandpa. It was the best. Saturday mornings when my mom was sleeping in, my brother and I, we would make our way to Grandma's house for pancakes. My sister, a little bit later, as she came along as well. Mom would wake up. She wasn't worried about us because we had a neighborhood that all the moms and dads looked out for all the kids. I had lots of parents where I grew up. They would discipline you, and they would do lots of things. I mean, as far as they'd take you places and buy ice cream cones, it's just, we were raised by a neighborhood. How many of you grew up in a place like that? For me, it was just awesome. It's kind of hard to find that these days. We hit the garage door opener, we go in, we close it, and we're in our house, and we don't see the neighbors much. But this was my grandparents' place, and again, I just loved being next door to them. Now, across the street from here was the house of one of my mom's best friends. And this is weird. This is kind of weird, but there was times that as kids, we'd play outside, but there were some days where I just wanted to go with my mom to the neighbor's house where she was having coffee. I didn't drink coffee, but that's where I found out what was going on in town. It was during the ladies' coffee time. And it was such interesting conversation about people. I just began to learn so much about the people of the town that we lived in Farmington. And so sometimes I'd just sit there for an hour. Well, sometimes even longer than that. But I'd just sit there and listen and listen and listen to it. And it wasn't just gossip, but just their conversation to me was so interesting. But other times the neighborhood kids, we'd get together. We'd play street hockey all the time. We'd play games, and we'd go to a block down, and we'd play softball or baseball in the middle school ball field. And just had a great time. So an incredible neighborhood in which I grew up. Absolutely loved it. You may have a great neighborhood, or your neighborhood might stink. You might be filled with houses that are like the first house I described. Everything is just perfect. They're all around you. Or you might be in places where shutters are falling off and the house needs paint and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes we think of our life that way. We think, I can't even have a relationship with God if my house is not in order. If everything's not perfect. I'll get perfect, and then I'll invite Christ into my life. That's not how he wants to work. He wants to come into our home no matter what it's looking like. He wants to be a part of our life no matter what our life may be like. Jesus came to live among us, to work like us, to experience life like us. He comes to our neighborhood. This is one of the great truths about Christianity that sets it apart from all these other world religions. Our God has not remained remote and unapproachable. He has come to us in person. He did not just write a letter. He did not just send us a representative. He did not just speak his laws from a mountain, and he did all those things. But he actually physically came to us. He came into our world. The infinite became an infant. Imagine that. The Bible describes the miracle of what Christ has done when it says, who being in the very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. Nothing. Taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and he became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Friends, he is the perfect model of a neighbor. And this morning, as I was thinking about Jesus coming into the world, I began to think about the people that he related to. Imagine how the Pharisees responded to him. They were kind of like the people that lived in that perfect house, so it seemed. In fact, the Bible describes them as being like that on the outside, but the inside, this whitewashed tomb. Jesus had a hard time connecting with them. They had a hard time connecting with him because that's not what they pictured as the Messiah being. And so a lot of the Jewish people that he came for rejected him.